Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Fireplace Podcast, episode 10. This one is called Building Bridges, and this is Mike. I'm here with Andy.
Hello.
And before we start, a quick disclaimer, none of what we're talking about is financial advice. We're going to discuss a few different concepts around financial independence and retiring early, but we don't expect you to take anything as we say as gospel. And this is purely just some discussion to prompt some ideas and maybe to help some people who are in a similar situation. Anything else to add to that, Andy?
No, that sounds all good to me. Yes, basically we're not financial advisors. We're just chewing the fat and trying to help each other steer our way through this. So we've no guest today. It's just me and you, and we're just discussing bridging.
Yes. So bridging is a term that comes up quite often, and we've mentioned it in previous podcasts, I think number 8 and a few other ones. And what we're talking about is building a bridge between one income source and another. So the example I think of is you're standing on the edge of a river and you're still working and you've still got your salary. And on the other side of the river is maybe access to your pension. But when you retire, you lose access to your salary and you've got to get across that river somehow to your pension and have some sort of income to pay for your living before you get there. So the
I'm sure
idea
we
is
could. I'm sure we could make this more complicated if we try.
we could, but it should make more sense when we go through some examples. So, I mean,
Okay.
in summary, the bridge is a pot of assets and things that generate an income until you can get to another source of income. And we'll go through some scenarios later.
So when do you start thinking about a bridge? Do you sort of make a projection and say, right, I think I'm going to be able to retire sooner than pension access age, therefore I need to start making some provision?
Yes, that's the big question is when you start thinking about this. And like most things, the earlier the better. So the first example of a bridge that most people will encounter is you want to retire before you can get to your pension. And you've been putting lots of money into your pension very sensibly. And then you think, hang on, I can get there before then.
This is your personal pension we're talking here, not your state pension.
Yes, that's right. Yes. So we'll go through various scenarios of typical bridge scenarios, but that's one of them. Before we go into bridging, I thought it might be useful to go through some fundamentals of investment and income, because a lot of people may not understand how that works. So with the pension, you either get paid a monthly amount or you get a big sum of money which you can invest yourself. And what we're talking about with bridging is doing something similar, but doing it yourself, probably using ISAs or some other funds.
Okay, because the term pension gets very confusing because it covers so many different things. Because people talk about their state pension, and you get a monthly income from that. But then there are people that also get a pension like that in the form of an annuity or the payout from a direct defined benefit pension.
Yes, that's a very good point. And I think we'll cover that when we go through the scenarios. And I think we'll start with the first scenario, which is probably the one most people think of when they talk about bridging, which is you've got a private pension, which is available at a certain age. And in most people's cases, that will be something like 57 or 58. It might be a little bit earlier if you work for the police or the armed forces, but you've got a pension that arrives on a certain date and you think, well, that's a bit too late. I don't want to keep working that long. I'd like to retire a bit earlier than that.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of first scenario we'll talk about.
Okay. And is it exactly the same logic for the other scenarios as well?
It's very similar, yes. So if you're retiring, say, at 52 and your pension isn't available until you're 58, you're going to have 6 years when, unless you've done something in advance, you're going to have no income. And that's the scenario we're talking about. And that's the 6 year period you need to bridge with something.
Okay, so what do you bridge it with, and where do you put it?
Well, the most obvious place to start is an individual savings account or an ISA, which is an account you can get where you can put £20,000 a year into any assets you like, and there's no tax to pay at all when you take the money out. So that would be the obvious thing to do. And obviously, you need to start that early enough so that by the time you get to retirement, there's enough in your ISA to pay you an income until you can get to the pension.
Okay. So if your projections are saying that you're going to finish early, you want to forego some of the pension top up bonus, all that tax credit, and instead invest in an ISA, knowing that, well, that I'm losing out little bit financially. I'm not gaining all that I could through pensions, but it's going to be there when I need it.
That's a very good point. Yes. So the downside of this is we always say, well, we mostly say on the group that pensions are the best thing going for most people to save up for their retirement. But if you want to retire before you get to your pension, you need something else. And if you need something else, that means you can't put all your money in the pension.
So ISAs are great for this because they're access any time, and you can put up to 20,000 a year of new money in, so that works. But if it goes beyond that, if people need an enormous bridge and start a bit late and realise, oh, I need to be piling more in than that, then they're forced to be overspilling the ISA and go into a general investment account, I guess.
Yes, that's also the case. We've seen that with some of our interviewees. So if you suddenly decide, oh, I'm fed up with work, I'd like to retire in 5 years, 10 years, 8 years, whatever, you probably or may not have enough time to get enough in your ISAs with that £20,000 a year limit. And if that's the case, then you'd need to use a general investment account, which is taxable. But again, it gives you another option, another not wrapper, but another vehicle to store some assets for that bridge period.
So that's why that makes this important to think ahead a bit, because you're limited by the ISA capacity. So if you start early, then hopefully that constraint won't be a problem to you.
Yes, and I think for a lot of people, it's surprisingly early. Um, in in my book, I give an example of a couple who have planned a retirement and have it all nicely planned out, and they start putting money into their pension, and they find their pension's doing quite nicely, and they're putting more into the pension as they get pay rises and this kind of thing. And then it sort of dawns on them that actually the pension's doing very well. They've got a bit of spare money. They can start putting spare money into the ISA, and then that means their retirement date gets earlier. And then the earlier the retirement date gets, the more you need in your ISA. So you've got to be a little bit careful to almost put a bit extra in your ISA just in case you want to retire a bit earlier than you thought.
Oh, that hurts though, because you're losing out on free money.
It does. Yes. That's a tricky one. So
Okay.
that's
So
that's our
run me through the other bridging scenarios then before we
yeah. So
get
the
too deep into it.
first scenario is the simplest one is you retire before you can get to any of your pensions and you need something to keep you going. And the easy answer to that is an ISA. And if you leave it too late or you can't get enough in your ISA, then you use a general investment account.
Okay.
So the next one we've talked about in the interviews is people who have defined benefit pensions. Now, defined benefit pensions are generally, well, they were much more common 10 or 15 or 20 years ago, but there are still quite a few of them around. And they generally are different in that, first of all, they pay you a defined amount of money each year or each month. And secondly, they aren't generally available until a bit later. So quite often they won't be available until 65 or maybe 67 or 68.
Okay, but there are some that are a bit earlier than that. Didn't we talk to somebody that had one at 60? And presumably they can take them a bit earlier and take a bit of a hit as well, usually.
Yes, yes, we did talk to. I just want to comment. We did talk to Michael, who had a armed forces pension, which was defined benefit and which is available at 50, but a lot of them are not available until 65 or 67, which is a little bit later than private pensions or SIPs, which are generally accessible at 57 or 58.
The one I'm
So
thinking of is we talked to Bex, who was quite heavily sorted with DB pension, but that for her was all her savings effort was all about bridging to the DB being available, wasn't it?
yes, yes, if you've only got a DB and you want to retire early, you've probably got quite a long wait and quite a long bridging period. Um, if you've also got, so some people might have a defined benefit pension and maybe a SIP or a defined contribution pension as well, in which case they're going to have two bridges. The first bridge will be retirement date till they get the first pension, and they might have a second bridge from getting the private pension until they get the defined benefit pension.
Okay. So would you also technically call it a bridge to be using your SIP until your state pension arrives?
Well, that's the third one, I think, which is
Yeah.
a pension between getting another pension and your state pension. With the defined benefit pension, the dates are usually pretty close to your state pension. It might be the same date or very similar. But yes, we would also call it a bridge if you get, say, you retire on our original example at 52, you get access to your private pension at 57 or 58, and then you've got another 10 years or maybe a bit more until you get your state pension. So you've got two bridging periods, one from retirement to the first pension, and then another one from that pension until your state pension.
So at your state pension, then everything's kicked in, everything's available. Is bridging done then, or is there a way in which we need to think about bridging later than that? What changes? The rules change at 75 for accessing things, don't they?
Yes, I mean it's not so much bridging anymore, but there is the period from when you get your state pension until you get to 75, when the pension rules do change a bit, and that's more of an issue if you've got, or if you want to be very careful about inheritance tax. If you've got a very large amount of money and you're trying to maximize what you pass on to your dependents, then there are some considerations once you get the state pension.
Okay, so if I'm starting building myself a bridge fund, say I'm starting an ISA, what do I need to put into that, and how do I figure out how much emphasis to put on that and versus the SIP?
Yes. So obviously there are two different objectives here. One objective is to get the maximum free money you can by using the tax advantages of the SIP. The other objective is to make the ISA big enough so that it's going to cover your retirement from when you want to retire until you can get to the SIP. And those two do conflict with each other a bit, but you have to basically take a punt at some point and decide what the split is. And as an example, and I know John Boston will agree with this, very roughly speaking, if you're planning to retire 10 years before you can get to your private pension, then you'd split something like 50-50 between the ISA and the pension.
Okay, so you start out on a trajectory like that, and then if the plans change, I suppose you've always got the fallback that in your last year at work you can just go all in on the accessible savings if you realise, oh, I'm insufficient in my bridge.
Yes. So I think the main thing is to get yourself in a position where you're flexible and the ISA has enough in it to at least cover what you originally planned as your retirement bridge, and the SIP's got enough in it to cover retirement from your SIP access. But as you say, things may change, and you may want to top up the ISA at the last minute if you decide that you're fed up with work or your salary goes up enormously, and you just think, well, actually, I can go a year earlier than I planned, but I better put some more in my ISA to pay for it.
Hmm. So the trouble with these a bridge, it's a much shorter timescale than we normally practice investing for. We base all our investing ideas on the stock market works for us long term, and that smooths out the volatility. And so if we're saying, oh, I want to bridge for a 7-year period, then that's starting to get a bit hairier in terms of, well, what if the market's down, drops in that time, isn't it?
It is, yes. I mean, depending on who you ask, some people will say you shouldn't really be investing in stocks and shares if you want the money back within a 5 year time frame. And a lot of people's bridges might well be 5 years or less. And in those kind of shorter bridges, there's a good case to say that investing in stocks and shares and funds maybe isn't the best thing to do. So, one thing I was going to say with that is that with the bridge fund, you probably want to have at least the first year or two in cash anyway, just to give you a bit of peace of mind and to get used to the idea that you've stopped work and you're going to have to start selling some things to make some money. And having that cash can give you a good psychological buffer to help you make that transition.
But you wouldn't hold that cash all the time you were building up this bridge fund. You presumably time in the market, so you do that as the last thing.
Yes, yes. So it all depends on how long you're planning to do the bridge. And I think also it all depends on how flexible you are in that bridge period. So going back to our example of someone retiring at 52, they've got maybe 6 years until they get their pension. Now you wouldn't want all your money in stocks and shares for a 6 year period because that's a bit short. But if you've got the first 2 or 3 years in cash, you may well find that after you've spent that cash in the first 2 years or so, the stocks and shares are doing fine and they can happily support the other 4 years.
I mean, this is the classic sequence risk situation, isn't it? Which we've talked about before, that being willing to flex in those first years of retirement and reduce your spending or do a little bit of work, de-risks everything.
Yes. Yes. So flexibility is the key in terms of your own spending as well. So the more that you can reduce your spending if things aren't going well, then the better options you have. And like you say, one option might well be since you've just finished work, one option might be if things go very badly, you go back to doing a small bit of work, either on a contract basis or even just a kind of helping out someone down the road basis. And that extra little bit of income can often make quite a big difference.
Right. So the main scenario we're talking about here is you've got some stocks, but you've also got a cash buffer in that bridge fund. If you start living off those stocks in there, I guess we've got to rethink about withdrawal rate because this is a shorter span. So we're not
Yes.
now thinking 4% rule with this
No.
because they should expect a higher withdrawal rate because this is going to be burnt through, isn't it, in a
Yes.
short number of years?
So one of the things that surprised me when I was talking to John about this was the 50-50 percentage for a 10-year bridge period. I said to John, hang on a minute, surely if you're retiring 10 years for your pension, you wouldn't need anything like half your money in the bridge pot. And he said, well, yes, you do for a number of reasons. And there are two big ones. One is that you don't know what's going to happen in those 10 years. And if you're invested in equities and the equities decide to all go down on the day you retire, you're very much at risk because, as you say, you're going to be taking a lot of that money out more quickly than you would otherwise be doing. But the other side of that coin is the 50% that you're putting in the pension, in the SIP, you're not even going to touch for 10 years. So that's got 10 years sitting quite happily to do its thing. And by the law of averages, by the time you get to the end of the 10 years, the 50% you've left in your pension has probably done quite well and had enough time to weather any recession or storm. It might not, but over 10 years, there's a fairly good chance it will have done.
Okay, so I'm seeing two sort of knock-on effects from that. One is you need to look at this withdrawal rate 4% in terms of your overall wealth, not just one of these individual pots. But then the other one is the alarming. Oh, my pension looks pretty small. You know, if I'm looking at 500,000 overall in these two pots, 50-50, that means I've only got 250 grand in my pension. So I've got
Exactly.
to depend on that's going to have those years of growth. We know that if if lightning strikes and the bridge fund does badly, then on balance the longer term pot has always done better and has had time to recover.
Exactly. And also, the reason the 250 in your bridge pot is so high is because it's giving you insurance to against that bridge pot doing badly.
Mm.
It does sound like an awful lot, and in most cases, there will still be quite a bit left in that bridge pot when you do get to the end of your 10-year period. But because of the way returns work, because there's a small risk of you using quite a lot of money, that pot needs to be very big. But in a lot of times, there will be quite a lot left in that ISA pot, so you could carry on living off the ISA pot in many cases and not even have to dip into the SIP for a year or two, maybe.
So what are the alternatives then? For this bridge fund, if we didn't want to do the traditional shares and a cash buffer, we it's possible you could buy yourself a fixed term annuity just to cover this bridge period, couldn't you?
Yes, I think for the shorter periods particularly, you start looking at much safer assets. And then I think for safer assets, what we mean is cash savings are the simplest one. You get a savings account. Um, if you're not paying tax, you get your £5,000 cash interest allowance, and a cash savings account, or you might need several cash savings accounts to, split the money up and have it on different accounts and that kind of thing. And then there are more complicated things like annuities. So an annuity is outsourcing this to somebody else. You give your money to somebody else and you say, I'd like this to give me an income of this much per year for this many years. And they give you a price and they look after it all for you and it's all guaranteed.
So it's an insurance policy, but it's just a single premium up front, and then the payments come for those 7 years, guaranteed. There's no
Yes.
risk at all.
So that's a term annuity, which is an annuity for a fixed term. So what's underneath an annuity is the other option, which is a gilt ladder, which some people talk about, which is much more complicated. But what you're doing there is you're buying bonds off the government, which are effectively IOUs, and you're buying a number of different bonds that mature at different times where you know exactly how much you're going to get back. But for all of those cash or cash-like assets, you're probably going to get a lower return than you would have if you'd invested it in stocks and shares.
And if you went down that route with the annuity, there's no pot at the end. There's no opportunity for that to perform better. So you're going to have to do your calculations and say, actually, I do need more in my pension later,
Yes, yes. I
because
mean,
there's nothing left in that was left in the ISA before that's going to be the overspill.
there are options with annuities where they pay out some money at the end as well, but obviously you're going to be paying handsomely for that option because somebody else is taking all the risk for you.
It sounds quite unattractive to do this at a young age. I know that annuities get better as you get older because statistically you're more likely to die. That doesn't apply here because we're just doing a fixed term, aren't we?
That's right. Yeah, they don't generally look very attractive before you get into your late 60s or 70s.
Is that
But
going to be the case for the fixed term ones though, where it's not about the likelihood of death?
I think there's still an element of death in there because
Mm.
they're still hoping, not hoping, they're still over the course of hundreds of thousands of annuities, there will be people who don't make it to the end of the fixed term, and they're contributing to everyone else's returns. So yes, but there's a fairly good chance there will be some spare money in your bridge fund at the end, and those obviously can then be used either to complement your pension or even to be used up and you can delay your pension a bit. And obviously, if you delay your pension, quite often that gives it a chance to be worth a little bit more when you get there.
So if you find yourself at the end of your bridge period and you've got some spare if I've got some spare in my ISA when my personal pension becomes available, what am I best doing at that point? Am I best eating the ISA first and leaving the pension intact, or the other way around?
I think at that point, what we'd probably say is the first thing you'd do is you'll top up your pension with the minimum amount, which is you're allowed to put a very small amount into your pension each year, even if you're not earning, as long as you haven't started withdrawing from it. So you do that for the first year or two. And then I think after that, you would start using up whatever was left in your bridge pot and then switch on to your pension. But that gets a little bit more complicated with tax and those kind of things.
Well, when I'm looking at, I know we're not really talking about tax and drawdown here, but I know that rule one is use up your tax allowances. So the if you're trying to use your 12,000 odd personal allowance each year, I guess you kind of want to take that from your pension first.
You would first, yes, and then maybe top
and
up
then
your
if you need
pension.
more, rather than drawing on a taxable basis, then
Yes.
then I'll hit the ISA now.
And I think you'd use the money from the ISA to get your free money from your pension, so your 2,880 into your pension automatically to get your free money. And then, as you say, the next step would be take the taxable money from the pension, and then after that, it's then going to be to use your taxable allowance up, and after that, it'd be back to the ISA again, and yeah, that kind of thing.
Okay, have we time for some personal examples here?
Yes. So, I mean, I think talking about us two personally, so I had a bridging period of a couple of years, 2 or 3 years between retiring and getting access to my SIP. So in my case, I wanted to have plenty of cash because it was a bit scary finally um, getting access to the SIP, and I had some ISAs as well, but I wanted to have the cash just to give me a bit of peace of mind. And as it happened, sort of partly accidentally, partly on purpose, I'd recently done a remortgage on a buy to let, so I had a bit of cash from that. And I'd recently sold a limited company, so I had a bit of cash from that. So both of those gave me a bit more confidence about retiring. And together with the ISAs, I definitely had enough to last me until I got to the pension access. But as I say, it was only a couple of years in my case because I'd left it quite late. How about you?
Well, in my case, I only had 6 months between finishing working and getting access to my SIP, but not that I've bothered accessing the SIP yet. So I'm still living on the proceeds of my business sale that just came out, and the cash that was in the business at that point, the buffer. So I haven't really had to think about bridging very much.
Right. And I think another consideration we haven't mentioned yet is we've all addressed this so far as an individual person, but if you're heading for financial independence as a couple, there's obviously more angles on this where you can time it either using your partner's ISA allowance. If you've got pensions at different times, there's a lot of things you can do to try and time this more efficiently and make use of those allowances, as well as doing things like putting pension contributions into the person who's paying more tax and those kind of things, which makes it a bit more complicated. But again, it gives you more options and more flexibility.
And presumably, as you go along, you keep a weather eye on how your portfolio is performing. If you're seeing that things are doing very well and this ISA pot is actually doing more than I need it to, then you can steer the new contributions more towards the SIP so that you maximise that pension tax credit.
Yes, and I think it's worth having flexibility in both directions. So if things go wrong, you want to be able to maybe carry on working a bit longer, build up the ISA pot a bit more, build up the pension pot a bit more. But also, if things go well, as you said, you want to have enough in the ISA so you can maybe retire a year or two earlier. You don't want to have the ISA running too lean because you don't want to then say, well, my pension's done really well, but actually the ISA is not quite big enough to stretch for the bridge period now. And that can be tricky. But as you say, if you keep track of your portfolios all the way along, you'll get an idea of where it's heading.
And I presume if things go badly, it's a self-correcting problem, because if my ISA isn't sufficient to support me to retire that early, that also means my SIP isn't as big as I had hoped. So I'm not going to be looking at retiring all that early after all.
Quite possibly, yes. Yeah, I think every couple of years you have a look at both, and that should give you an idea of what to expect. And I
Every
think,
couple of years, isn't everyone doing this, looking at this daily and weekly and tracking
well,
their
they probably
portfolio
are,
progress?
but they probably shouldn't be because if you look at it too often, it doesn't change that much. But it's good to look away sometimes and get on with your life. Easy for us to say, but I think that's a sort of rough summary of bridging. I mean, we'll cover this obviously in a lot more episodes, and it'll come up quite regularly in our interviews. We're going to talk a lot more in the future about drawdown strategies as a whole, which goes into much more detail about how you draw money down from your pensions and how you plan those kind of things. And we mentioned briefly sequence of returns risk, which is the risk that things go badly at the very start of your retirement. And we'll cover that in a lot more detail, as well as some of the upside risks. So if you suddenly get an unexpected bonus from work or you get an inheritance, what to do with those kind of things. And also, I mean, you mentioned it earlier, Andy, if you've got too much to put into an ISA, you're going to probably need to run a general investment account. And there's a little bit more work involved in doing that as well. And we'll cover that in a future episode.
So if people are wanting to skip ahead and these subjects are relevant to them now, we do already have our wiki, so there are articles there for free on our website that they can go and browse and skip around at their leisure.
There is. There's a summary of bridging on the bridging page, which we've done recently, and there'll be a link to that in the episode description.
Super. Anything else to say before we wrap up?
I don't think so. No, we've got the Buy Me a Coffee link on our wiki as well, in case anyone wants to buy us a coffee or a beer or a sandwich. I think that's pretty much it for bridging.
Super. Thanks very much,
Great.
Mike.
Well, thanks, Andy. Thanks, everyone else, for listening. We'll talk to you soon. We've got another one coming in a few days, I think, haven't we?
Yes, one lined up.
Lovely.
Very good. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye, everyone.